In today's episode of Podcast for Inquiry, I speak with Dr. Sandra Fahy. She earned her BA and MA from York University and then went to the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London, where she got her PhD in social anthropology. Her thesis involved long term work with North Korean refugee communities in Japan and South Korea, gathering oral histories on the subjective experience of surviving the 1990s famine. Her peer reviewed articles and policy pieces have been published in outlets such as Asia Policy, the Harvard Journal of Health and Human Rights, the Georgetown Journal of Asian Affairs, Anthropology Today, and Food, Culture, and Society. In our conversation, Sandra and I discuss her book, Dying for Rights, putting North Korea's human rights abuses on the record. But the majority of our conversation ranges broadly about North Korea's place in the world, its responses to accusations of violating human rights, and even into matters of morality and philosophy, such as what responsibilities one nation state has to interfere with the internal workings of another country. Without further ado, I bring you my conversation with Dr. Sandra Fahy. Welcome to the Podcast for Inquiry, brought to you by the Centre for Inquiry Canada, a national educational charity supporting your community for reason, compassion, and secular humanist values. You have answers, we have questions. I'm your host, Leslie Rosenblood, board member and secular chair for CFIC. Welcome. Dr. Sandra Fahy, thank you so much for coming today and speaking with me on Podcast for Inquiry.
My pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
I want to talk to you today about your book, Dying for Rights. And it's I've gone through it. It's putting North Korea's human rights abuses on the record. So your subtitle gives us at a very high level the thesis of your book, but I was hoping you could maybe take a moment or two and tell us about what Dying for Rights contains.
Okay, thank you so much, Leslie. Well, I believe it could be in the intro or possibly in the conclusion. I describe the book as a grave marker. And by that, I mean, I'm alluding back to the idea of the record. So the book is an attempt to record and make available to anybody who wants to read this text the history of North Korea's human rights abuses to its own people on its own soil, but also to its Korean ethnicity abroad, and also the human rights violations that they have committed to others within North Korea and internationally. And then another aspect of the book, because it's written in two portions. The first portion looks at physical integrity rights violations and also kind of socioeconomic, political human rights violations. The second part of the book looks at how North Korea attempts to exonerate itself from culpability for allegations of human rights violations. And it primarily attempts to do this through state representatives that appear at the United Nations or in side events at the United Nations, or through state representatives that speak at somewhat official gatherings in London or in DC. And but the bulk of that second part looks at how North Korea tries to deny allegations of human rights abuses through its own state media apparatus with fake documentaries and other sort of reportage that they create in terms of video and indeed textual news reports. So yeah, that's the book attempts to put something into the world that has yet been put into the world in this fully consolidated manner, which is to account for what the North Korean state has done in the world since its founding in terms of human rights abuses. As I mentioned to you before we began to speak, there were many things that I could not include. Um,
Mm-hmm.
the book is already quite long. I could have included things on POWs. I could have included things on abductions. There were, so for instance, those chapters that I had written had to be cut out because the book was far too long.
Yeah, and there's a little bit about abductions in remaining in the book, but I guess there's a lot more to be said.
There's far more to be said. I mean, just going on that for a moment as a sort of footnote to what we're saying, most people reflexively might imagine that abductions have a lot to do with Japan or Japanese nationals, whether they're ethnic Korean or, in fact, Japanese. But South Korea has a greater number of individuals who've been abducted to North Korea. And that history is not well known, but I wasn't able to cover a lot of that.
Generally speaking, North Korea hardly has a stellar reputation worldwide. To
Hmm.
somewhat understate that, and North Korea is hardly the only
Hmm.
state that abuses its citizenry. So, what motivated you to document this particular country's atrocities?
Well, that would require me to go back quite a bit. I've been working on North Korea and South Korea, and by extension, the region for the last 20 years. I began with the question when I was in my kind of undergraduate degree. I was looking at forms of collective social suffering and how individuals wrote about those experiences after the fact. And I became aware that globally there were no histories of individuals who had survived famine writing about their experience. And we know famine is a form of political violence. Well, then I moved to South Korea, began to learn the Korean language, and I focused on that work for my PhD. So that formed my first book, Marching Through Suffering, Loss, and Survival in North Korea, which is, I guess you could say, the first record of oral histories from famine. So that was my initial entry into the study of North Korea. Um, and after I wrote that book, which was published with Columbia University Press, I was in the midst of writing another book, and Columbia asked me if I would write a book that kind of looks at the entire spectrum of human rights violations out of North Korea. And I believe perhaps Columbia University Press asked me to do that. Well, one, because in the contract they wanted me to write another book, and of course I was going to do that. But also, the United Nations Commission of Inquiry, which had been established in 2013, came out with a human rights report itemizing all of North Korea's human rights violations in quite eloquent and accessible detail, published in 2014. And so there was around that time, 2015, 2016, a big interest in trying to consolidate all of the known bits of information we have about human rights violations. So this is what led me to agree to write the book for Columbia University Press. I must admit, I hesitated before agreeing right off the bat to writing the book. Why? Because I knew that, as I'm sure you know, when you focus on something, other things in the periphery kind of lose their attention, or things can sometimes be skewed when you have too much of a hyper focus on things. I mean, I guess I can elaborate on that a little bit more. With my first book, I was still, after writing the first book, I was still somewhat, I suppose you could say, sensitive, or took a liberally nuanced approach to how I interpreted and engaged with North Korean propaganda, North Korean defectors, all of this. But I have to say, after writing the second book and doing, profoundly the deep dive into all this material, I mean, my office was filled, shelves were filled with the material that I collected for this. And that formerly nuanced approach that I took to the state has disappeared. I am far more critical, far more accusatory, far more condemning. Because, I mean, yes, you can say, well, that's because you focused on this. If you had focused on the literature and the arts of North Korea, well, then you wouldn't be as condemning of the state. But, like, as an example, this is the change. Like, when I wrote the first book, I probably would have said, people shouldn't be tourists to North Korea. Really, don't let your kids travel there, even though they want to see some of the most unusual places in the world. But now, after writing the second book, I would say absolutely no, don't travel there. don't visit this country. This is not a place that you can do business with. This is not a country that you can negotiate with.
But every country has human rights violations. If you were to, I mean, there's, I guess, a little under 200 countries in the world.
Yes.
Pick one at random, throw it, and you do a deep dive into their history, into their actions. You're going to find some pretty unsavory acts done by the governments of any nation in the world. Was this part of what made you hesitant to do this deep dive on North Korea,
Mhm.
or do you think that there's something that puts North Korea in a league of its own, acknowledging that nobody is a saint or no country is a saint?
Very nicely said. I appreciate that. So I hear you saying two things there, and I agree with both of them. No country. I mean, wouldn't it be nice if there were a country that we could go to,
Yeah, I
Leslie?
mean, and a lot of people have that, from the book, the Gospel according to Saint Matthew. Let he who is without sin cast the first stone. Since there's
Mhm.
nobody without sin, how dare you criticize another country because your own country, wherever you happen to be from, is hardly a paragon of virtue.
Mhm.
Can you comment on that and why you ultimately decided to write about North Korea?
So first of all, like I completely agree with that. Um, that there is no country which protects human rights perfectly. It doesn't exist. And I had the great opportunity to work with activists, lawyers, practitioners at the Harvard Law School with the Human Rights Program there on a sabbatical. And there is this question of, oh, well, are we too critical of other nation states? I mean, particularly we're in the West, you and I are in Canada, North America, um, but human rights for all of us in any state are aspirational. Um, and of course, you know the work of Hannah Arendt, who I quote in the book, who says it's when we need human rights the most that we can access them the least, right? So I am now living in Canada and I have endless access to protections. But because I live in this very wonderful country, I don't need to turn to them, right? Yes, and even my own birth country, which is Ireland, has an atrocious record of treating women and women's access to reproductive health. You might have heard of the mother and baby homes. It was a huge scandal that emerged out of Ireland. So, yeah, I mean, I can talk about Black Lives Matter in the United States. I can talk about residential schools throughout Canada. I can talk about, human rights violations in South Korea, human rights violations throughout Japan. I mean, yes. So there is that point. So no country is immune to critique. However, I would say that we absolutely have to acknowledge, if we acknowledge no country is without critique, it would be a lie to say that there aren't any differences among them. You know, there's a reason why when people choose to migrate or flee countries, they're fleeing in particular directions. Now, some of this has to do with access. It has to do with previous migrations, things like that. But often, people are trying to move from a worse situation in terms of human rights. Um, Often it could be cloaked as, you know, poverty. Well, that's an economic human rights issue, and they want to move to a better location. So there's that aspect. But you said, is there anything? I'm forgetting the phrasing, but you very nicely said, is there nothing that kind of sets North Korea apart? I think that's the phrasing you used. And there actually is something that distinctly places North Korea apart from, I would argue, possibly any other state in the world. Now, any listener who can prove otherwise, by all means, please email me, and I would love to know if this is not the case. But where North Korea distinguishes itself is that North Korea has no known civil society. And as you'll appreciate, civil society is the space where individuals can gather and make critiques of their government. And if their government doesn't listen, they can appeal to the international community to place pressure or demands or sanctions or negotiations on the government on behalf of this group or community. North Korea has no known civil society. There may have been instances of individuals trying to rebel. So, for instance, there are stories of a prison rebellion. And by rebellion, I mean like a small group of individuals resisting. But from the earliest history of North Korea, there were profound political purges, and they solidified, I guess I'm mixing my metaphors, but ensured the total absence of a civil society. The closest thing North Korea has to a civil society is its exiled migrant community, also called defectors or seetomin, new settlers in South Korea. That is the closest thing you will get to a civil society from the North Korean population. There is no uh, group that is independent from the state that can speak with the voice of the citizenry inside North Korea. In fact, when North Korea sends its citizens overseas, for instance, in diplomatic service or ambassadorial service, or indeed in terms of logging or shipping or other types of work that they're sent abroad to conduct, even those individuals are not permitted to engage as freely as people in those countries that they are sent to with media, internet, local communities, radio, etc., etc. In fact, many of them are not even permitted to collect their own paychecks. So in the book, you might recall that North Korea, I call it North Korea exports its framework of human rights violations uh, along with the individuals that it sends abroad. So they cannot create a civil society. They do not have one. The defector community does. But as I identify in the second portion of the book, North Korea goes to extreme extents to eviscerate those defectors who achieve a level of prominence or receive a large audience to listen to them. North Korea goes to great extent to create documentaries. I mean, really, they are not documentaries. They are rather forced performances on camera that they use to eviscerate the character assassinate these individuals, these defectors. So
I want to get into that actually a little bit more. I mean, part two of your book, it documents North Korea's vociferous denials that
mhm.
it has ever violated any of its citizens' human rights. And I can understand why they do this internally. It bolsters their legitimacy and keeps the regime in power, and people don't question it because they're being told that everything's the way it ought to be. But as you just mentioned, that they also go to considerable lengths to project an image of legitimacy and of being a human rights defender to the international community.
Mhm.
Given how effective a blackout of information they have made from of news and facts from outside of the country, why is it so important for North Korea to defend its reputation internationally? Why don't they just say, you consider us a pariah state? Fine, go ahead.
We're going to embrace that.
you know that.
We're going to lean into that.
Yeah. So why go to so much effort to discredit its international critics
Mhm.
and to defend and bolster its reputation internationally?
The first thing I would have to say is that, and I'm sure, Leslie, you've probably noticed this. I mean, tell me if you have noticed this. I've certainly noticed it in the last probably 15 years. I'm sure it's been around much longer, but that this tendency to, I've even found it among academics, people who ought to know argumentation styles, who ought to be able to, one would think, be able to debate and critique. It's this thing that I talk about in the book as well, this kind of argumentation style that North Korea puts forward. It's called tukokay. You should talk, or you're one to talk, right? So this classic thing that you alluded to, like who's going to cast the first stone? Well, nobody can cast the first stone because we've all committed sin or we're all doing something bad. So North Korea really evokes that. And they evoke it, for instance, by saying, well, how can you, well, first of all, they don't even say they have political prison camps, although there was a slip. And one of the representatives of North Korea said, well, we do have re education camps. But anyway, North Korea will immediately deflect and change the topic and say, well, in the United States, you have the largest imprisoned population, blah, blah, blah. Look at how you treat African Americans in the United States. And of course, there is plenty of evidence to support these claims.
Yeah, they can be completely factual and rigorous in their analysis and their critiques of their critics.
Indeed, I have learned quite a bit from reading North Korean news. For instance, like I learned about that case when I was quite young when it happened, but that case of Nayera, the woman who gave false testimony to US Congress, I believe it was in 1991, which then justified the Gulf War. And this daughter, Nayera, was the daughter of a Kuwaiti ambassador, I believe. And they had hired a PR company to say, who had done research and saw that, if you speak about children, and even better, if you speak about infants, it's going to galvanize a population to be very concerned and wish to seek justice. And this is what Nayera basically did before US Congress. She lied and she told false stories about babies being taken out of incubators and things like this.
Both Gulf Wars were based on a lie then.
Yes, yes, yes. And so there was a Canadian group of folks that produced a documentary about this. And I hadn't seen that documentary, but when I read, of course, I was reading copious amounts of North Korean news. I came across this case of Nayera and I thought, who is this Nayera person? And then I read. So basically, what I'm saying is, yes, there are truths in there. However, there are also quite a bit of lies, quite a few lies. So, for instance, North Korea will talk about a famine happening in New York. And of course, according to the standard definition of how we would describe a famine, there has not been a famine in New York, But let me go back to my point, which is that North Korea will switch the topic. So they will say, okay, we hear you saying we have prison camps, or you say that we are committing human rights violations. They may even be more vague than that. And then they'll say, well, what about the United States? They do X, Y, and Z. And those things will be true. And they will say, what about South Korea? South Korea does A, B, and C. And Japan, well, Japan does these other things, And all those things will be true. Now, going back to my point, what I was saying, I notice this even among academic circles, that many people will feel quite persuaded by this style of argument. But actually, it's not a mode of debate that's reasonable or accurate at all. You are, in fact, changing the subject. It's not a fair point of discussion because you are, in fact, then trying to chase the person from topic to topic to topic. And it's moving you further away from the point of consideration, which is, why is it that you, the government of North Korea, are failing to protect the rights of individuals in terms of the rule of law? You do not even have the rule of law. Yes, America has trouble in terms of its protection of individuals within its country and justice and injustice, people being falsely accused. But in the case of North Korea, you do not even have the rule of law. People are not even told why they are arrested, right? And so this is basic. But then you can take it in another direction. And I mentioned this very briefly at the end of the book, which is that North Korea, some people could say, well, North Korea is a very poor country, and this is why they cannot protect human rights. Or North Korea has suffered tremendously through history, and this is why they cannot protect human rights. But actually, as I mentioned in the conclusion of the book, North Korea need only not persecute, need only not execute, need only not censor. There are many things North Korea could do that would, in fact, save them money in terms of ammunition, in terms of bullets, in terms of radio blocking technology, right? And that if they were to cease these actions, they would already be improving the human rights within their country. So it's not so much about where they're not protecting rights, it's also where they're going out of their way to persecute. They're going out of their way to violate. And so this is quite condemning of North Korea, I feel. So the question then becomes, why doesn't North Korea do that? Right? Why doesn't North Korea say, okay, well, there is this critique of us, and yes, we're poor, or yes, we're sanctioned, yes, we're isolated, but we want to align ourselves with the international community and not commit human rights violations. So we will cease public executions. We will cease disappearances. We will see. Well, the reason they don't do that is because this would be the dissolution of the state control and the state's ability to govern through fear.
You just said something that I want to question because I'm not sure that it's true. And you said North Korea wants to align itself with the international community.
Mhm.
And if that is true, that comes as a surprise to me because I've not, your scholarship on North Korea far exceeds mine, of course. But nothing I've seen really makes me think that North Korea has any desire to
Mhm.
align itself with the international community. More, it seems more along the lines of, well, maybe the Kim family dynasty does what it does, and then does what it wants to, and then searches for where it might align with the international community, and says, "Aha! You see, we're aligned on these, three disparate points."
Yes.
Is there a desire to be a full fledged member of the international community, or is it just an opportunistic see what we can get from the rest of the world?
I think I said if North Korea is interested in. So even I
Yes,
am
you
not
did. You
quite
did say
sure.
if.
Yes, yes, even I am not quite sure. However, I think there are at least two things happening for North Korea. One, they do not deem the kind of global alliance of the United States, Britain, like the Five Eyes, right? Australia, they don't deem that as legitimate. They don't deem the Universal Declaration of Human Rights as being completely legitimate in and of itself. Instead, they believe, for instance, those states which are of the non allied movement, right? Those states which are or were kind of allied, for instance, with Russia, China itself, Syria, Libya, that the way these states, and I can mention many more, the way these states approach human rights is better. The way these states approach negotiation is better. So, for instance, as I mentioned in the book, North Korea puts forward its own vision of human rights. So it says, for instance, that, rights are things that you are granted, they're not inherent, right? And also that rights are something that you earn. Also, that rights are something that are collective. Of course, we have these somewhat iterations in terms of the collective now when we see how human rights have developed from 1948 to the present, right? Group rights, indigenous rights, women's rights, children's rights, et cetera, et cetera. So it has evolved since 1948. But North Korea really
Mhm.
cleaves to this idea that your, as a fellow human, your human rights are protected only when the state's sovereignty, the state's rights are protected. So this is the narrative that North Korea puts forward.
Country first, and only once the country or the regime, the current
Mhm.
rulers of the country are safe and protected, and only then do they have the latitude to grant certain freedoms to the populace.
Yeah.
That's the position that North Korea stakes out.
Yes, absolutely. And also that, as you captured, like that it's granted, that these are given, that you have a duty to the state. So this setup enables the state to be benevolent toward you if you should deserve it, right? So you can see how it's a kind of slightly twisted or skewed or alternative version of how human rights are understood, principally by the broadest number of the international in the international community, right? So While North Korea may want to be heard and seen and acknowledged in the international community, I believe they do because they suit up and show up for these things, as many authoritarian states do, as many problematic states do and have done. Um, this is a forum where, for those who are less critical, possibly for those who are less skilled with debate and knowing when they're being duped, like, so for instance, with this 2 argument saying, well, what about this? What about that? What about, I mean, someone's taking you on a wild goose chase there in terms of topics and subjects of, human rights violations there. They're avoiding addressing the issue, right? That would never work in a court of law. Some people even say, well, you know, that might work in academia, but doesn't work in the real world. Well, it actually doesn't work in any world. It doesn't actually make sense unless you're kind of duped by it and you kind of think, well, yes, okay, these other countries do have these problems. Oh, yes, okay, yes, that's true, that's true. And it creates this kind of false equivalency. But going back to the thing about legitimacy, yes, I believe North Korea does want to be deemed as a legitimate state. One, because there are individuals who see the North Korean state as legitimate, and by which, when I say legitimate, I mean kind of an honorable, dignified member of the international community as a state, right? But in the other way, I think I referenced this in the book too. Rees and Skikkink are scholars who write on human rights, and they also look at how states have kind of normalized their relations. What they found is that at the earliest stage, so for instance, with countries like North Korea, there is this initial denial phase. We don't have any human rights violations. You guys have them. And then next, there is the kind of negotiation or bartering stage, or like at least also the attempt to enter the international community as a legitimate state. And so the idea that Rees and Skicking put forward, these scholars, is that eventually such states might be integrated into the international community, and a time will come when they begin inch by inch to respect human rights. So, for example, North Korea welcomed or invited, and then she accepted the invitation, the representative for persons with disabilities. She was invited to North Korea. She came, she gave a talk. I can't remember exactly when this was. It might have been 2019. Anyway, it's mentioned in the book. But what's fascinating about that is, so North Korea permitted her to come because, of course, disabilities. Every country has them, individuals with disabilities. And, I mean, it's not condemning to the North Korean regime to try to protect the rights of individuals with disabilities. But what is interesting is, so North Korea gave her access. But even as she was given access, she was still able to see that North Korea wasn't presenting the whole truth in terms of what she was shown in terms of individuals who had disabilities. So, for instance, she was able to mark the absence of individuals with multiple complex disabilities. She was able to notice that new buildings, which had been erected in Pyongyang, did not have accessibility.
Stairs instead of ramps.
Exactly. Or no elevators, no working elevator, all these sorts of things, which through the absence of certain things that she knew to look for from other states, the absence of these things spoke volumes, right? So, as another example, North Korea can be often reluctant to identify that a certain percentage of the population might have Down syndrome. When in any country's population, you're going to find a certain number of people will have Down syndrome. So, the absence of these individuals, as demonstrated within the population that the representative for disabilities witnessed when she went to North Korea, the absence of these individuals being present speaks volumes. So while North Korea is trying to normalize itself by inviting individuals like her, when North Korea is all about pantomime, they want to appear as such, we're protecting human rights, so they can meanwhile carry on inside the borders as they wish. And they can continue to, the Kim family dynasty can continue to benefit financially from the international community.
I'd like to pull back a little bit and sort of take a broad focus. I've got a couple of things I want to ask you about. Uh, First, more generally, we're here in Canada, unless you are a scholar like yourself, uh, you know, the chances that any Canadian is going to
Mhm.
visit North Korea is very small. So, why is it important for us to understand what's going on in a relatively small, uh, poor nation of, I think, about approximately 24 million people on the other side of the planet?
Mhm.
Why? There's always the answer, well, of course, scholarship and more knowledge is better, and documentation, but there's a passion
Mhm.
uh, that I detect in you that it makes me think that you believe this is important, and I don't disagree, but I want to understand why the listeners of Podcast for Inquiry, who are predominantly in North America, though not exclusively,
Mhm. Mhm.
should be interested and should care about what happens in North Korea.
Yeah, that's a great question. And of course, like I am very passionate about this topic and I became more passionate about it when I lived in South Korea. Of course, I met many Koreans in South Korea who would say, "Oh, why are you learning Korean? Why are you in South Korea?" And sometimes I would feel a little kind of shy or embarrassed to say, "Oh, well, I'm learning Korean so I can speak with North Koreans." And they would frequently say, "Oh my God, I'm so embarrassed. Here you are, a foreigner, and you're learning Korean, and I'm South Korean, and I'm not doing that." And they would express embarrassment. Now, that could have been a kind of reflexive way to perform a national sort of embarrassment slash compassion for North Korea. Um, but I often just sort of felt, I mean, this is probably going to sound like a weird answer, but I often just sort of felt, well, no, like you should live your life. You should carry on and live the best life you can live. Like I was never condemning to South Koreans for not kind of taking a bigger role. Although some people are condemning, Justice Michael Kirby, for instance, who was part of the Commission of Inquiry for the investigation of crimes against humanity, which the UN put forward in 2013, produced the report in 2014. He said, imagine if during the Nazi occupation of Europe, there had been a country of Jews, a Jewish state, which could have accepted people, which could have spoken out, but didn't, right? Well, they have that in South Korea. That exists in this case, right? Now, I'm not trying to create an equivalency between Nazi occupied Europe and North Korea, but there are extreme human rights violations, crimes against humanity happening in North Korea. Does it reach the level of genocide? Well, that's a matter of definition. But there are considerable human rights violations that are happening in North Korea, which should shock the conscience of any living human. Absolutely. Um, so for people who are listening in North America, I think it's all dependent on the person's character. It's rare for an individual to have compassion for people that they have never met. Like some people describe this as a different type of intelligence, that you care merely because they are your fellows, not because they are of your same religion or same ethnicity or same gender or same sex or whatever.
We share a common humanity, and that
Yeah.
is enough for there to be
But then
compassionate.
the question could come, well, but Sandra, then what about the Uyghurs in Xinjiang? What about people living in Tibet? What about women in Saudi Arabia? What about individuals who are in Syria right now? The Yazidi women who are treated, what about those in Afghanistan? So, of course, you could pile this on and on and on. And I just sort of feel that, at least in my case, and I don't wish to make this a kind of, because I find it quite embarrassing to speak from myself, but each individual has to contribute, if they wish, in the way that they can, to bettering the lives of others. I mean, there are people who don't care at all about the lives of others, so there's no way I would ever convince them. But I think if there's somebody, for instance, like Hyundai, the founder of Hyundai, he contributed um, immensely to North Korea in terms of farming, in terms of animals, in terms of all kinds of contributions like that. There are many wealthy ethnic Koreans who live in Los Angeles who make their contributions to this cause and to this issue in their own way, right? Like I'm an academic, I am profoundly privileged in my job. And each day I try to honor that great privilege of having this job I have my dream job. And yet some people would say, well, you have it on the backs of these individuals who are suffering. And possibly that might be true. But what I'm also trying to do, or what I am trying to do, is make people aware of kind of conditions that they may not otherwise be aware of that are happening inside North Korea. And that one doesn't need, like I said, one doesn't need to be Korean. One doesn't need to have any kind of ethnic roots to Korea to care.
I no, I understand that the when you listed all of these oppressed groups in the world, Uyghurs, Yazidis,
Hmm.
North Koreans, and uh, the other thought that came to mind is, uh, here I am in Canada. What can I do? I mean, I may feel compassion. I mean,
Hmm.
I feel terrible for the awful things that people are being forced to endure, not through their own making. But what, aside from perhaps learning, like I've read your book,
Hmm.
and I understand the dynamics that the regime that exists in North Korea operates under more than I did before. But what can I do as a Canadian? Like I have a job, I have a family, I'm an activist on topics that have nothing to do with North Korea, and that kind of fills my days and evenings. And
Hmm.
every now and again, I like to read a book for pleasure, or occasionally watch some TV, spend time with my kids, etc. Even if I were to devote some time to this, what is it that people can do
Hmm.
to improve the plight of North Koreans, of women in Saudi Arabia, of those suffering under the Taliban in Afghanistan, and unfortunately, on and on and on.
Yes. Well, so I'm sure, and I'm glad that you furnished me with some vision of your own day to day life, with your kids and the activism and also your intellectual world. There are issues that I am very passionate about, like animal rights. Um, and things like this. And I do, put my money where my mouth is. I'll contribute to those organizations. In terms of North Korea, and in addition, if people are interested in like Yemen or Saudi or, Syria, I'll just speak about the case of North Korea. There are two great organizations I would encourage people to get in touch with. In Canada, there's one called HanVoice, HanVoice. And Han, of course, refers to the kind of ethnos of Korean people. HanVoice is an organization that's doing incredible work. They're a nonprofit organization. They are doing work in terms of educating young university students. They might be reaching out to high school students, I'm not sure. They're training these individuals in terms of human rights education, but also in terms of the North Korean human rights issue. And as I said at the beginning, North Korea really demonstrates to us something which is unique. What's unique in terms of North Korea's persecution of its people is that they have no voice at all from within their country. And this is truly unfair when I look at the case of other countries, right? So, even in the case of Saudi, even in the case of the Uyghurs in Xinjiang, there are still individuals who are able to get their voices out. We don't see that in the case of North Korea. So HanVoice is a group. I'm on the board there, which is a wonderful opportunity for me. But they do a great job, and as I said, in terms of educating about human rights, in terms of educating about North Korean human rights, and secondly, what they're doing, which is incredibly valuable, is they're trying to bring, I believe it's 15 North Koreans to Canada to settle. And I believe it's 15 women that they're trying to bring, and possibly also their children. Because you can imagine, of course, the status of North Korean women is and children is even that much worse. Um, the other group that I would encourage people to look into is called Link, Liberty in North Korea. And this group is throughout North America, Canada, the United States. I believe they might have some chapters in Europe. I'm not sure, but they're also based in South Korea. And they do work in terms of, again, raising education, awareness, but they also do work in terms of rescuing North Koreans, actually working on the Underground Railroad. So working on migration, illegal migration out of North Korea. So they're actually saving individuals. So that's something people can practically do. Another thing, and this is something people can do regardless of which community or topic that they're interested in, is to get involved locally. There might be, in the case of North Korea, an ethnic Korean community, ethnic Korean cultural center or church that you can get involved with. Likely there are individuals in a lot of churches, Korean, ethnic Korean churches who are involved with this issue, because there are quite a few religious organizations, whether they Buddhist or Christian, who are involved with rescues. Not all, there are also secular groups. Um, but also, if you are, for instance, interested in Saudi issues or Syrian or Yemeni, then look for that diaspora community wherever you live and see what kind of contribution you can make. But also, listening to, there are now North Korean YouTubers, subscribe to their channels, buy their books, attend their talks, share the literature with others. I think the more that we can raise awareness about this, the better. I've seen, in the 20 years that I've been working on this subject, I have seen improvements. I have seen changes. The human rights movement, the diaspora, that community of exiles of North Koreans in the international community, has grown. Our ability to challenge North Korea's hermetic control on information has changed. We are becoming stronger. Yes, North Korea is becoming stronger too in terms of how they control and crack down on information. They're keeping pace, but we are growing stronger. There are North Korean defectors who are comedians. There are North Korean defectors who are doctors. There are North Korean defectors who are completely fluent in English now and who are studying in the United States, who have studied at Columbia University, at the Bush Center, et cetera, et cetera. So these individuals are out there. And if anyone wants to reach out to me, I'm happy to put them in touch with some organizations. Yeah, so I think that's, everyone can do a little bit.
You mentioned that the North Korean government puts the state above all else, and that is primal, and that everything else devolves from there. And in your view, what should be the limits of national sovereignty? Like, we hear about national sovereignty really from all governments. I mean, I think
Mhm.
from what you've described, the North Koreans take that to an extreme, but all governments cherish and make a priority their national sovereignty. So, in a philosophical or moral sense, you know, if how much, what right do we have to impose our sense of rights upon other nations? When
Mhm.
are we obligated to do so? And at what point does one overstep? Like, I remember a decade ago, I was campaigning within Canada to repeal Canada's blasphemy law, because I think that is an unjustified infringement on free speech. And I'm happy to say that in the past 10 years that it has been repealed. But this is not a popular opinion
Mhm.
globally. And at the time, the Organization of Islamic Cooperation were campaigning to uh, to 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 effect a ban in all other countries
Mhm.
on expression that was offensive to Muslims and other religions, and so they want to prevent offense. And I'm a guy in Canada. They're a consortium of, I think it was 57 different countries. Uh, so where when do we have an obligation to step up and say what you're doing in that country, that other country, is wrong and you need to change your ways? And when do we overstep and say and become Western imperialists, or trying to establish hegemony?
Yeah, again, that question is so rich. My mind is sort of galloping off in many directions.
I don't want to ask easy questions.
Yeah, it's great. Well, the first thing that occurs to me is this. Let's see if I can hold on to all my thoughts as I tell you. The first thing that occurs to me is this. I'm sure you've heard it before. Democracies can make accommodations for socialism. It can make accommodations for people who are, orthodox in terms of their religion. It can make accommodations for, even it does, perhaps unintentionally or unwittingly, make accommodations for extremism, right? But states such as North Korea make zero accommodations for democracy, make zero accommodations for free speech, make zero accommodations for free media. The second thing that I wish to say is that, yeah, the question of states that you began with? Like, where is the limit point? And it reaches back to this matter of civil society. The check on government has always been the media. Now, of course, the erosion of that we've seen in the United States, possibly to some extent in Canada, you'll have to forgive me, I've been abroad for 20 years, so I haven't been paying that much attention to what's going on here. Um, but the ability for an individual or an individual with her collective or for a publication to make a critique of the government, right? As we've seen in Canada, I think there's that woman who claims to be the Queen of Canada and wants to replace. Sorry, I chuckle because I just find it a little bit amusing and I don't know enough about it, but a woman who wishes to supersede the role of the Commonwealth and make Canada independent or something like that. Well, anyway, within democracies, we have that ability to critique, to make claims against our government. That's not anything that's possible within North Korea, or indeed in places like Xinjiang, in China, in Russia, in Syria. And I could go on and on. But so that is the thing which has to be protected, because the government is then accountable to us. The state is then accountable to us. But I'll just say one further thing, which is quite key. Again, this is another unique feature of North Korea. I think, in combination with the absence of civil society, this feature also makes North Korea kind of more concerning, which is that kind of dynastic succession, the Kim family. In fact, the Kim family is above the state. Like, North Korea has these 10 kind of rules of behavior and things like this, and all of them are about um, surrendering yourself to the leadership, right? This is even above the Constitution. If the Constitution were to hold any kind of relevance to the real world of North Korea. So those are the three things I would say in response to your question. But please feel free to come back and we can engage this more.
That gives a good framework for what makes a country like Canada different from North Korea. Engaging in civil society, having the ability to say, however things are today, they could be better, and here's how. Having the ability to
They could be worse.
well, yeah, well, of course, but I don't imagine that somebody within a country says, "I want to make things worse. Come with me, and let's make things more terrible for more people." But they're going to say, let's make things better, regardless. And sometimes things do get better, and sometimes that's not what happens. But for you, the distinguishing characteristic is without state penalties, people are able to petition the government and say, we can improve things, and here's how. Please make these changes.
Yeah, these are the things we want. But for instance, here's another thing, and I was thinking about adding this, just in terms of people becoming more aware of different things globally. Like, so for instance, I often tell my students, well, I read a lot of things all the time, and I read a lot of things that I disagree with, or a lot of things that kind of challenge my assumptions or my kind of inclination. So of course I read North Korean media, and that is not necessarily something that I completely agree with. So I think it's good to be challenged. So, for instance, I sometimes read Douglas Murray, who's considered quite conservative, who's quite challenging to a lot of ideas about migration to the West, et cetera, Islamic extremism. He has a lot of views that I don't agree with, but then some things that he says, I think, oh, that's kind of an interesting claim. That's kind of an interesting argument. Just as when I'm reading North Korean propaganda, North Korean news, I think, oh, that's kind of an interesting claim. Let me see how I can engage with that further. So I guess what I'm trying to say there is, so for instance, on the point of Douglas Murray, he would say, as with migration, you have individuals who are coming. I mean, I don't necessarily agree with this. This is just what he's saying. Individuals who are coming who are dedicated to Islamic extremism, who are interested in practicing Sharia law, who want to, and I'm not saying this is every migrant. I'm not saying he says this is every migrant, but he basically was talking about Britain and how certain migrant communities are very homophobic, who think homosexuality is a crime, right? And this is something that in the West we would kind of blush to admit. I don't. Do I see that as a crime? Of course. For me, absolutely not. Love is love. People should love who they love. But if you have, people coming into a community who say, no, no, this is the way we want things now, they can indeed change the laws and democracies of that space. So I'm on a little bit of a tirade here, but do you catch what I'm trying to say? That, um, let's see, what am I trying to say here?
Part of what you're saying is that we need a little bit of intellectual humility, that even people that have opinions with which we disagree, you have to understand why you disagree, and
And what
if you're
they're
going to
saying.
refute them,
Yeah.
you have to first understand what they are saying
Hmm.
before you can effectively refute their arguments. And there's always the chance that in the process you'll learn something that will force you to change your opinion.
Or perhaps make it more robust. And this, yes, thank you so much, Leslie. Sometimes my thoughts gallop away with me and I can't quite fully um, capture them again. But this idea that, really let's try to figure out what they are saying. And that's what I do in the book as well. Like, what is North Korea saying about its human rights? What are they claiming when they claim that they respect human rights? What are they actually saying? Is it coherent? Does it actually make sense? And actually, what you'll find is that it's quite incoherent. Some of it doesn't make sense at all. So, even in their own human rights report, they say, sanctions that we're under right now, meaning the contemporary, the last 10 years, have caused
Mhm.
more death than even during the Korean War. Well, that's absolutely not true. That is patently untrue. That is an incoherent statement. But they will make these claims. So, yeah, I mean, I think it's very valuable to see what they are saying, how they're saying it. And yeah, I think it helps us to find a way to bring them into possibly further alignment with human rights in a way that they might not necessarily anticipate that they are participating in, right?
Shortly before your book was published in 2019, the
Mhm.
United States radically changed how it engaged with North Korea. This isn't in your book, but I would really like to know your thoughts on how Donald Trump treated North Korea differently than his
Mhm.
predecessors, and whether that change was beneficial or detrimental to stability in the peninsula and international relations, and also whether it was beneficial or detrimental to the populace
Mm.
of North Korea.
Yeah, that's a really great question as well. So remember, Trump was like Rocket Man, Little Rocket Man, kind of highly emasculating.
My button is bigger than your button.
So to me, that sort of rhetoric was quite, I think, I mean, it's unusual to use this expression when referring to the Kim dynasty, but a little bit cruel or a little bit, well, just very unprofessional, embarrassing.
And yet he was also the first president to visit North Korea and to grant an, I mean, the way it was phrased in the media was the U.S. president granted an audience to the leader of North Korea.
Yeah, so he was the first US president to visit with the North Korean leader. And that, it's so interesting because in some ways it was refreshing to have somebody try a different approach to North Korea. So the initial kind of my button's bigger than your button, Rocket Man, that was kind of like a kind of neon color version of what the US had kind of been doing before, which was that North Korea, we're not taking you serious, you're an axis of evil, we condemn you, da da da. It was sort of kind of alternative universe version of that. But then when Trump was like, well, I'd like to meet with him, I'd like to have a hamburger with him, or whatever kind of comments he was making, for me, it was a little bit refreshing because it was finally mixing things up a little bit. But I was also quite concerned. And I was concerned because within the state of North Korea, one of the key things that they need is for the US to see them as legitimate, for the US to kind of engage with North Korea on an equal footing, for North Korea and the United States to be seen as equals, or in fact, for North Korea to be seen as better, stronger, more legitimate than the United States. right? That's an image that they want to send out domestically. And it's also something that they would like to share to any kind of believers or any kind of sympathizers who exist in the international realm. So that was achieved when Trump met with Kim. The other thing that I think was bad, so that I think is not good. I mean, some people would say, well, so what if they're considered legitimate? Well, domestically, it's problematic because already North Koreans have so little access to information that it's very difficult for them to contextualize their own government, their own state. Many people say, this is sort of a footnote to that statement. Many people say, well, North Koreans have access to South Korean media, Chinese media, Japanese media, American media, blah, 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 right? They're watching Squid Games. But a very interesting report was published by Nat Kretchen and Jane Kim, and I quote this report all the time because its findings, I think, are quite critical and not highlighted enough. The report was called A Quiet Opening, and one of the key findings of that report was that North Koreans' perspectives of other countries had changed. The way they viewed America has changed among those who watched foreign media. Yeah, their perception of South Korea has changed. Their perception of Japan has changed. But this is the key finding: North Koreans' perception of their own government had not changed. So now I said to you at the beginning, what's unique about North Korea is that they have no civil society. The other thing that's quite unique about North Korea, and truly heartbreaking, is that the people of North Korea have never seen, ever, media made by them and for them. They've only ever seen the North Korean state make media for them and about them. They have no idea what it is to read an op-ed or a short story or to hear a podcast made by North Koreans who speak freely and openly to North Koreans who can speak freely and openly. Not since the founding of the country, and even we can go further back because Korea was under Japanese occupation, and indeed during that time. There is no living person in North Korea that has ever created or enjoyed media created by them and for them. So this is quite a critical point. So as I said, the fact that Trump can be made use of by the Kim family is, I think, a bit dangerous, because the final point I'll say is that many North Koreans, when I was interviewing them for related to the famine that happened in the 1990s, at no point did they see the North Korean government as responsible for having caused the famine. They didn't see, whether act of omission or commission, that the state was responsible. Instead, almost inexplicably, they saw Japan, South Korea, and the United States as responsible for the famine. So that is a result of lack of information, decontextualized information. North Korea had said in its own media that there was a global food crisis, but actually it was a global food pricing crisis, just like we have now, which caused the famine. So this is, yeah. So the fact that Trump engaged, in some ways I thought, this is refreshing. And in other ways I thought, this is dangerous. Because like I said to you at the beginning, I really feel North Korea is not a state that can be negotiated with. There's a defector who wrote a book called Dear Leader, an excellent book, Jan Jing-sung, and he says that if you're talking to North Korea, it's a counterintelligence operation. And I really do believe that's true. But if that's true as well, then we have to engage with it as such and always be thinking how we can sort of get human rights protected and angle for other things in the process of having that kind of counterintelligence conversation.
Okay. Dr. Sandra Fahy, this has been great. Thank you so much. We've been unfortunately not talking much about the content of your book, Dying for Rights, but all the issues that surrounding it. So if this podcast has been of interest to our listeners, I strongly recommend read the book. There's a lot of information, a lot of content in there that we didn't really cover in our conversation.
Mm-hmm.
Dr. Fahy, what's next for you?
As I was writing this book, at the end of the book, you remember the second portion of the book is a kind of forensic analysis of North Korea's state media. As I was finishing the book, Jamal Khashoggi was killed in the Saudi embassy in Istanbul. You might remember this.
He was a correspondent for the Washington Post.
And Jamal Khashoggi's fiancée was waiting heartbreakingly outside for him to emerge, and he never did. But a body double did emerge and was captured on CCTV as he walked around Istanbul. His feet were much bigger than Khashoggi's, so he didn't wear his shoes. And Khashoggi also had some male pattern balding, and this gentleman decided not to shave the top of his head, but he went out as the body double. So the new book that I'm writing is looking at how states globally for the last almost 100 years, since 1927 is the first case I have, how states have used video, whether actual film video or CCTV video, to deny the human rights abuses that they commit. So Saudi was trying to deny that Khashoggi had been murdered
Right,
inside.
because he was seen walking around town and his credit cards were used after, right?
Yes, and you
Oh,
and you may recall that. So that happened when I was finishing the book, and I thought, this is interesting. And around the same time, um, two gentlemen went through the UK to Salisbury and attempted to kill a former KGB agent, and they were caught on CCTV. And they actually filled out a TripAdvisor review for the cathedral that they had visited, saying, "No, it's not so eventful," and blah blah blah. And so this was Russia trying to cover up its assassination attempt against this former KGB officer. North Korea, you might recall, killed Kim Jong Nam in Kuala Lumpur airport, and used two women. I believe one was Vietnamese, I think one was Thai. And one of the women, excuse me, was wearing a t shirt that said LOL. And she said, "I thought I was part of a reality TV program." So again, this was caught on camera. She was wearing the LOL t shirt, all this kind of stuff. So they knew, the agents knew that these women would be captured. The KGB agents knew that they were being seen on CCTV, and so they should go up and put a TripAdvisor review of the cathedral in Salisbury. Saudi knew that the body double would be captured on CCTV.
so this
Um,
gets into the nature of truth and how to uncover it, and how,
yeah, so this is a new book.
when you publish your next book, please come back onto Podcast for Inquiry. I want to talk to you a great deal about how just
I'd love to.
normal citizens can determine truth from propaganda, and
Yes,
the tools that we need to use
it's 100 years.
individually and societally. So I really look forward to that conversation.
1927 is the first case I have from Russia. I look at the United States. I look at Israel, Iran. There's all kinds of Japan. There's loads in there. We're all guilty.
I'm really looking forward to this. When can we expect this book to come out?
Probably another couple years because I have all my cases and now I'm just writing up. So fingers crossed. Thank you so much, Leslie.
Please remember me when it's published, and I
Oh, I
look
will.
forward to reading it and speaking with you
I
again.
won't forget. You
Dr.
have great
Sandra
questions.
Fahy, thank you so much for your time, and thank you for appearing on Podcast for Inquiry today.
Thank you, Leslie. My pleasure.
We hope you enjoyed today's episode. Links for today's discussion can be found in the show notes. If you enjoyed today's podcast, please subscribe and engage in the conversation. Comment, rate, and review. We'd love to hear your perspective. The Podcast for Inquiry is brought to you by the Centre for Inquiry Canada. We rely entirely on donations to be your voice supporting science, free inquiry, critical thinking, and secularism here in Canada. To our supporters, thank you. If you have not yet contributed, please consider making a donation at centerforinquiry.ca/donate, or becoming a member for only $30 per year at centerforinquiry.ca/join. Your support will help make it possible for us to continue making our collective demand for reason and evidence-based decision-making everywhere. CFIC is on the web at centerforinquiry.ca. Find us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter at CFI Canada. Podcast for Inquiry is produced and edited by Matt Payne, Nikolay Nikitushkin, and Martin Zelinsky. Music by Anthony Luzaro. See you next time.